Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Energy MD podcast, where we help people with chronic fatigue, ME/CFS, long COVID, MCAS achieve the life that they deserve. So, super excited to talk with my good friend Maya Shetreat. We've known each other for several years now, and we're going to be talking today about a number of different things, but psychedelics, energy, quantum. And yeah, I'm really excited. So let's learn a little bit about Dr. Shetreat. So she is a neurologist, herbalist, urban farmer, and author of The Dirt Cure and The Master Plant Experience, The Science, Safety, and Sacred Ceremony of Psychedelics. She has been featured in the New York Times, the Telegraph, NPR, Sky News, The Dr. Oz Show, and more. Dr. Maya is the founder of the Terrain Institute, where she teaches earth-based programs for transformational healing, including professional training programs for psychedelic-assisted approaches. She works and studies with indigenous communities and healers from around the world, and is a lifelong student of ethnobotany, plant healing, and the sacred. Dr. Maya, thanks so much for joining me today.
It is my pleasure to be here.
So let's start off with kind of like how you got into psychedelics. What was that journey like for you?
I always like to say that I got into I was pulled into psychedelics kicking and screaming. I actually um, I actually was traveling to Ecuador because I had had an experience with my son where he was very sick. So we had actually had mold in our New York City apartment, and he was the canary. I didn't feel well. Everybody didn't feel well, but my little guy, um, was the canary in the coal mine, and he was up every single night, not able to breathe. And
Hmm.
so there was just no way we could ignore, right? Like you always kind of want to avoid whatever. We didn't at first realize we had mold, but then we did, and we left. We left the apartment for 5 months, lived somewhere else. They gutted all of the areas that had mold, um, and had to do all kinds of repairs, but it was gutted down to the studs. We moved back in 5 months later. It had all been tested, it had been cleaned with like toothbrushes. We had gotten rid of all the upholstered furniture. I mean, some of your listeners, I'm sure, and you know how deep it can be to have to clean up after mold. So, like, no stuffed
Mhm.
animals, all the clothes had been cleaned, the whole gamut. And we moved back in, and 2 weeks later, my son had a seizure in the
Mm.
bathroom that had been the epicenter of the mold. But there was no mold in that bathroom. It was literally had been cleaned to the studs. Like everything, tiles, everything was brand new. And it was really obviously very scary. Here I am, an adult and pediatric neurologist, right? And I'm sitting there holding my little guy, who at the time was 7, and we had done everything, and he was on all the supplements, he was on all the diet, he was on, I did all that. I was treating people from all around the world, and I was like pretty, confident in my abilities, and just, there was this moment of holding him and knowing, like, with my whole being, that I did not have the tools to help him. I knew this was like something energetic, right? Something that was beyond the physical or the mental or any of the things that I really knew how to help. And I just knew I was going to have to kind of go on a journey to find what he needed. And so I actually reached out to a few teachers, and I won't get into the story, but there are these stories where there are these teachers who sort of turn you away, right? Like there was a lot of this, like, you get turned away, you have to go back, ask again, they turn you away again, you have to, right? That's like, it was a very like mythical kind of story. And ultimately I found my way to a fourth generation shaman who from Ecuador, who also had a PhD in ethnobotany, working with master plants. And she saw my son. She happened to be in the US. She saw my son, did a healing on him that was so profound. And I said, I'd really like to study with you. Is there any way I could learn with you? And she basically invited me on this trip to Ecuador, which um, all materialized at the very last second, which is a very like South American thing, is like time is not like time up here, and controlling people, ideas that you can control your time. No, also. But I found myself on this trip to Ecuador. I didn't know anybody on this trip. It was a group of people. I went by myself. I didn't speak Spanish. I was like going to this strange place for a few weeks away from my family for the first time for all that time. And on this trip, we were supposed to be learning about these powerful plants among other healing approaches. And they never said anything about, oh, we're going to engage with psychedelic master plants. I thought we'd learn about them, but no, in fact, there were some experiences of ingesting them also, which was a surprise to me. I had this very profound experience actually with a San Pedro cactus, very unexpected. And this was over a decade ago. You know, my son is now a hale hardy 18-year-old guy, 6'3", in college, you know, totally healthy. He just ran a big Spartan race where he, you know, was like, I don't know, 15 miles or something. But I came back with this new understanding about indigenous healing approaches, and particularly master plants, these very powerful plants, which I know we'll talk about more. And, you know, I'm still unpacking what happened on that trip well over a decade later.
Wow, magical.
Mm.
So it seems like with you know, everybody that I see has some sort of trauma. You know, oftentimes when people hear that word, they think that it has to be something severe, but it can be, you know, something even what would be considered as mild, rejection of a peer group, as opposed to some sort of sexual abuse. But how does trauma relate to cellular memory and some of these health issues that people have?
So, you know, I think you bring up a really important point, which is that there's sort of what we call big T trauma and little T trauma. Um, you know, big T trauma, we have these things called ACEs, adverse childhood events, as one example. A lot of those traumatic events do happen in childhood, but obviously it can happen later in life as well. And I can explain why the ones in childhood are so wildly important and why they imprint in a certain way. It actually has to do with these things called critical periods. And there are these windows of plasticity where we're very, very, very fertile and open to any event that happens to like imprint itself. And that happens more in childhood than any other time in life, except, for example, with psychedelics and master plants. So we can get more into that later. But this idea of trauma, what happens is that either you can have the big T trauma, like, you know, abandonment or incarceration of someone in your family, or addiction or abuse, you know, physical, mental, sexual, and so on, right? And sadly, these are actually very common things. They're not uncommon for people to experience. But then there are also the little T traumas, as you say, which are, right, like bullying, right? Or having, like, let's say a care provider who doesn't pick you up on time every day after school. And so you're like, you know, like little things that you wouldn't even be able to talk about. And different people experience those differently too. So, you know, even within a family, one person, things might roll right off their back. Another person might really, really experience those as acute, difficult, awful experiences. And what happens is, whether it's a physical event, whether it's an emotional, mental, or spiritual event, your cells don't really know, right? Your cells just remember being put into danger, right? And so there's this concept of cell danger. Cellular memory is this kind of posture that the cell takes by whatever it is that happens, whatever instigator of whatever kind, the cell goes into danger mode. And what happens then is it expresses that oftentimes in physical or mental ways. So we think, oh, this is a physical problem, but it doesn't have to be. It can be something mental, emotional, even spiritual that happens that's, you know, really uncomfortable for a child or an adult. And then the cells remember that in this way and express it then as kind of danger basically all the time. And that can look like autoimmunity, it can look like chronic fatigue, it can look like migraines, it can look like, any other kind of chronic pain issue, it can look like allergies, terrible allergies, it can look like depression, OCD, right? All of these conditions that we think of as, we want to get really kind of physiologic about and say, oh, yes, like this is what's happening in the body. But kind of thinking about the instigator, it can be something that we don't even realize because cells speak the language of the body, right? The physical body, but they understand physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual insults.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. So then coming back to kind of the psychedelics and the use of psychedelics in clinical practice, there's been definitely a wave. It's obviously much different than what we learned about in medical school. Um, why are people now talking about it as legitimate treatments?
Yeah. So, to answer that, we have to think a little bit about what happened in the 50s and 60s. And I know if you have any people of the boomer generation, for example, like, automatically they hear about psychedelics and are thinking, about what happened and bad trips and, people jumping out of windows and this kind of stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in fact, a lot of people don't know that in the 1950s and 60s, there were very, very promising studies going on looking at things like depression and OCD using psychedelics. And then what happened is there was sort of this free for all where there wasn't really appropriate support, but also, I would say, respect for the power of what these let's say in the case of like mushrooms or such, like what these master plants can do. um, and so there were a lot of problems. People were having bad experiences, they weren't preparing, they weren't supported, etc. So um, so that's the past, and they got outlawed for many reasons, including very political things. And what we're seeing now is that there have been such promising studies done on psychedelics that every major academic center in the world now has psychedelic research ongoing, including psychedelic centers at places like Johns Hopkins and NYU and Stanford
Wow.
and the Imperial College of London. So we're seeing papers coming out almost every week looking at um, mostly large doses, but we can talk more later about different ways of dosing. But like, in other words, like one dose of mushrooms, let's say, of these, psilocybe mushrooms, popularly known as magic mushrooms, with support before, during, after. And that's important because that's part of every single study that's been done. One dose can interrupt lifelong depression that has been refractory to every other treatment out there. One dose can interrupt lifelong addiction. And we're talking about smoking, we're talking about alcohol, and with certain psychedelics like iboga, actually even to heroin or meth or things that are actually incredibly addictive and very difficult for people to get off of. Never look at it again.
Hmm. Wow.
So we're seeing that with OCD. We're seeing that actually even studies with dementia and a lot of other kind of conditions that we think of as being very, very difficult to treat. We're seeing now that psychedelics in these studies with support before, during, after are so effective that there is nothing out there that competes with this. And this is just with one dose, right? We think of you have to take pharmaceuticals lifelong, or you have to, or even with supplements, right? And it's not to say these replace, taking good care of yourself and being, eating the right foods and exercising and all those things. But this is, an incredible way to interrupt that cellular memory. And we can talk about how.
So before people listening to this right now, they're about ready to shut this off and they're going to go run out and find psychedelics as soon as they can, right? So, what are some of the things that they have to look for, some caveats or some concerns about going ahead and doing that right now?
Yeah, there are many. The first is I don't think that big doses of psychedelics are for everybody all the time. So, the first thing I would say is, this isn't like a should. Oh, run out and do this thing. This is really about, being educated. And, I'm not a proponent, in fact, of everybody going out and doing psychedelics. There are people who think, oh, the world would be the most wonderful place if everybody just did that. I don't actually think that's necessarily true, because, humans are humans. Like nothing's just going to make everything perfect. But that said, there's also, if you have a history of psychosis, or a family history of psychosis, that is contraindication right now, at least. Um, there's also other kinds of issues, certain medications that might be contraindication. So it's really important to have someone who is psychedelic informed to be able to tell you if you're a good candidate from a safety standpoint. And then, of course, there are parts of the country where this is legal. There are parts of the country where this is decriminalized. And there are parts of the country where this is still not legal. So that's another very important part of this, is to know about what your city or state or country, depending on where you are in the world, what they say, right, about engaging with psychedelics. So that's very important. And then, of course, having the right support and knowing what you're getting, right? You don't want to just, find something on the dark web, right? There have been people who come to me and say, oh, I know I could just know, right? We want to be really intentional. And this is both from a physical safety standpoint, right? A legality standpoint, and also from a spiritual standpoint, from an intention standpoint, going with care, with attention, with intention. So, from my standpoint, don't run out, and right, like Google, but start, like I wrote a book all about this with a lot of science, a lot of information, a lot of history, a lot of lore. So like you can start with something like that. Or just start, for me, like I started growing San Pedro cactus, right? Because I got back from that trip and I was like, wow, I really want to know this master plant better. And it's totally legal to grow San Pedro cactus. I don't ingest my plants. I grow them because that's the relationship, right? So it's like building this relationship, and there's a lot of ways to do that. Is a way to sort of start to get to know, whether you're reading about it, whether you're looking at pictures, whether you're just simmering with it, right? Whether you're growing the plant, there are ways to engage and build the relationship and see if this is really the right move for you.
Interesting. Out here in the Pacific Northwest, we have beautiful forests that have lots of mushrooms. And so people oftentimes will say, well, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to find some of these psychedelic mushrooms. And another warning is that every year people end up with liver damage and potentially death because they've eaten the wrong mushroom. So you definitely have to know what you're doing. So then starting off with reading your book, and then are there resources in the book on like where to go to get good sources?
Well, I
Or how do you do
have
that?
trainings for that, and I offer a lot, people in my community, I give a lot of free guidance and free resources because, you know, obviously because it's variably legal or decriminalized across the country and across the world, I don't want to just like throw people, a bunch of links, right? But if people reach out to me, I'm always happy to help and guide, and that's a really, I think, important part as this is becoming widely decriminalized. Like now we have, Washington, D.C., many cities in California, including Oakland, San Francisco, the whole state of Oregon, Denver, Colorado, I think Ann Arbor, Michigan, and more. The state of Connecticut is now about to do a whole study of allowing them for medical purposes. So we're, I think, going to see this within 2 years. Really, I think much, much, much more available in mainstream settings than we probably can even imagine. I think it's rolling out even much more quickly than cannabis did.
Wow, very exciting. So you've kind of mentioned the word psychedelic, you've mentioned the word master plant. Can you talk to us a little bit about the difference?
Mm. So master plants are actually an indigenous term, and they are basically describing powerful plants, but it could be flora, fauna, fungi, right? Like it could be mushrooms, it could be plants. Um, it encompasses that whole category. Um, Powerful plants that alter our consciousness and behavior. Now, people might automatically be thinking psychedelics, but in fact, some master plants include coffee, right? The coffee plant. Another master plant is the cacao plant, right? Which makes chocolate. Another master plant is the tobacco plant, right? So these are powerful plants that change the way we behave, right? Think about what people are willing to do for their morning coffee or to get their chocolate fix, right? So those are all master plants. So powerful plants are masters. Psychedelics are always masters, but not all masters are psychedelic. Does that make sense? So the master plant includes under the umbrella plants like the ayahuasca vine, the San Pedro cactus, peyote, mushrooms, the psilocybe mushrooms, the amanita, etc. There's many, many, iboga, many more that I write about in my book. But these are sort of the most popular right now, the most popular psychedelic plants that people know about. And the idea of these master plants is, in fact, that they are masters and they transmit ancient knowledge through them to us that instruct us, in a sense, on how to operate in the world and how to be human beings, right? And there's a lot of theories out there right now about how they've played a role in even evolution. One of the things I write about in the book that I thought was very surprising to me in my research was about cave art. So I was looking back at the history of how master plants have been used over the course of history, and I was surprised to discover, because I learned in fifth grade or whenever it was, about like cavemen and cave art. I was like this, oh, it's that like primitive art that people drew because they didn't know how to draw better and they didn't have words, and talked about what they do every day in caveman times. Sort of, I think, what most of us were taught, right? And it turns out actually that cave art is very rarely at the opening of caves, which is where most people would have been living and operating. They were actually, and this is why we still discover cave art to this day. Most cave art is very, very, very deep in caves. Low light, no light, low oxygen, in fact, kind of this like ceremonial space that it turns out was totally not where people would have lived, but where they might have gone for altered consciousness experiences. And it turns out, first of all, that many of the drawings were done by women. That's interesting. And they know this from the hand size and other things. But in fact, also a lot of those drawings were shamanic drawings, like half human, half animal, and different kinds of ideas like that, that were done probably in the dark, and were part of visions. And many of them incorporate mushrooms or cacti or other known master plants, including sometimes they even find DNA evidence in those areas of master plants like datura or San Pedro or other kinds of cacti or plants. So it's very interesting, right, that there was this sort of, probably even then, secret or off the radar kind of ceremonial practice with these plants that were that's longstanding, probably since the beginning of time.
Wow, fascinating. So when we say psychedelic, what is that? What's the definition of that word? What are the changes, I guess? Yeah, how would you define it?
Yeah, that's a great question because, psychedelic is not something like when I learn with indigenous teachers, like the word psychedelic is like, what? Because this is a kind of invented word of, that kind of came about in like the 50s and 60s. Um, and what it describes is these, classically speaking, it is, um, from an experiential standpoint, something that alters reality such that you kind of can't tell the difference between the vision and the reality, reality, right? But from the standpoint of neuroscience, these are classically, okay, and there are, of course, exceptions to everything. They activate a certain serotonin receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, in the brain and in the body. And that kind of goes along with, right, there can be nausea, there can be vomiting and GI symptoms along with these altered states of consciousness. So activating that particular receptor is considered one of the definitions for classical psychedelics.
Interesting. And so then what's happening physiologically when somebody consumes one of these plants?
I mean, I want to tell you, and I say this at the very beginning of the chapter on the science, is, I've interviewed over 100 researchers and others who are very knowledgeable about psychedelics over the past many years. And even the top scientists who have published the most in the most prestigious journals from the most prestigious institutions basically say we really don't know that much about why they work the way they work. But I can tell you a lot about what we do know. So I want to just start by saying, a lot of times a cell that is in a cell danger mode, right? Let's say someone who's very depressed, we know that their neurons are actually less connected to each other than the neurons of someone who's not depressed. They're literally lonely neurons. Okay, think about it like that. And this actually even happens in a cell that is in danger mode. It even happens on a mitochondrial level, right? So there's a way in which our mitochondria, we think probably if you know anything about mitochondria, these energy makers of the cell, and I assume your listeners do, that, like if you know anything about what they look like, it's like I learned this in, high school biology or something, and they all look, whatever they look like. But in fact, mitochondria change structure. They're very individual. And in cell danger, mitochondria actually go into this meatball mode. So normal mitochondria are branched spaghetti. They are elongated and they are branched. They're touching one another and they're communal. They exchange information. They exchange nutrients. They release waste. They're very, very communal. And that's a healthy mitochondria. And then in a danger mode, mitochondria ball up into meatballs. So they don't communicate in the same way. They actually don't exchange nutrients as easily. They don't release waste as easily. They're not exchanging the information in the same way. So thinking about our cells as being, right? It's like quarantine, right? They go into this sort of isolation mode when they're in danger. And anybody who has something like chronic fatigue or major depression or any number of other chronic conditions are likely to have their cells more in that kind of situation. What psychedelics do, and this happens in many different ways and on many different levels, they actually, DMT, which is a component of many psychedelics, acts as an indirect antioxidant, which is protective of the mitochondria. It's very directly actually active at that level. So that's number one. Number two, they actually increase plasticity of the neurons and of the cells in general so that, the mitochondria become more branched and communal and the cells, the neurons, let's say, become more connected. So new synapses form between neurons. And this kind of plasticity, as I was saying in the beginning, right, we have these window periods in childhood where these events happen, and we never have quite that plasticity level again in life. We do have plasticity. So when I was in medical school and when I was even in my neurology training, which I promise wasn't that long ago. It was not yesterday, but we were told Yeah, childhood, maybe through teenage years, there's the chance for plasticity and new brain connections and so on. But after that, nothing. We now know that our brains change and grow, and we have plasticity throughout our lives. And there are things that we can do to enhance that, that don't involve psychedelics at all. But what we do know is that those window periods, those critical periods of plasticity, do not repeat later in life. So that's good news and bad news, right? It means that in childhood, the events that are negative for us or positive are going to imprint and stick with us for a very, very long time. It means that when we have difficult experiences in adulthood, they don't tend to be as imprinted on us. But with psychedelics, goes back to that idea of cellular memory. Psychedelics open critical periods of plasticity again and allow us to make those new connections, both between neurons, but also between different parts of the brain that don't normally communicate with one another. So it allows us to have these kinds of experiences of open-mindedness and really awareness and learning that is very, very important. And I want to give you an example that I think is so interesting. So most of the time we think when we go into a new situation, right? Like we go into a room full of people, we think we're seeing every detail, right? We're like, okay, there's the lady in the yellow dress and there's a guy wearing a hat and, you see all the things, there's like a blue wall, etc. Okay. So it turns out we actually don't see very many details at all. What we do, and this is part of what our brain does for survival, the default mode network is responsible for this. We go into a new room, let's say, filled with people, and we pick out a few details only. Everything else we fill in from past experience. Okay, and this phenomenon is called predictive coding. And it's great, like I said, for survival, because if, you don't want to wait and be like, oh my God, there's a tiger waiting to pounce on me, oh, like, look at the teeth, look at the growling, look at the tail, right? You don't have time for that. So that's important, right? And of course, we want to live from the wisdom of our experiences. But the problem is that sometimes if we once had a very scary experience, let's say, or unpleasant or something, and that kind of imprinted on us, that can be what we fill into every new situation, right? Those are the details from past experience that we can be filling in. And so then we think everything is going to have that same, tone, let's say, right? So if we're fearful or anxious, or if we're very depressed, or if we, feel like we don't make friends or whatever, we're constantly kind of predicting that and projecting that onto present moments when really we don't always need to, because that doesn't allow us to change. So what psychedelics do on that kind of grander scale is they allow us to shut down, take offline the default mode network responsible for that predictive coding for periods of time, and so that we can see reality in a very different way without all of that coloring of past experience. And the last thing I'll say about what psychedelics do in larger doses, but I think in smaller doses too. I do microdosing coaching with people and quantum dosing coaching. So I've seen this in all different doses, is something called the mystical experience. And that sounds very, wooey, but in fact, there are scientific studies, right? There's definitions of what makes the mystical experience. And that is actually what the major academic institutions are looking at as what is the most transformative about a psychedelic experience, is actually having that quote unquote mystical experience where you feel that sense of oneness and less like you are separate from the rest of the world and more like everything around you is alive and connected, and that you are part of this one consciousness. That kind of experience is considered a very important element of how psychedelics heal us.
And so that mystical experience is essentially that creating that critical period or that opening.
The mystical experience is an element of that. The critical period of plasticity is open. And I want to say this is where support, preparation, integration, having someone who knows how to do this and guide this is very important, because when you open those periods of plasticity, anything can happen, right? Something negative happens. Again, you don't want to create circumstances that are not supported. You want to be in like, you want to have all the pieces that can make that opening of that window, right? New memories that are good memories for your cells, right? So we can't always control how an experience goes. And in fact, I will say, just because, things come up that are painful or difficult, which does happen, and I think happens often, right? Not
Hmm.
like horrible nightmare experiences, but difficult things come up because we're shutting down this part of ourselves that kind of is our ego, that protects us from all these old memories and different things. So people will say like, oh, this thing that my mother did, or this experience that I had, like, I actually see truth about it. It hurts, but I see that, I have compassion for everything around that. Like, I don't feel like the kind of pain I felt, right? Like, so the experiences that can come up, it's not all like unicorns and rainbows, right? When we say mystical experience, it sounds really wonderful. And those aspects can be very wonderful. But then there are these other aspects, which is things that make us sad, or painful memories, or old traumas that can come up too. And being supported through that is exactly how you use these kinds of periods of plasticity that you're opening to reboot, right? To rewrite those memories and understand them, right? I call it meaning making. It's understanding, right, that um, these events happened, nothing we can do to change that. But when we make meaning of them and live from the wisdom of that, it can change everything for us.
Yeah, I can't remember where it's from. It might be Buddhism, where the idea that all of suffering comes from meaning making.
Mm.
Especially, well, when we make the meaning something that's not necessarily supportive,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned a little bit about microdosing, quantum dosing, macro dosing, tripping. Can you kind of speak a little bit to this? Like, do you have to trip to get the benefits? Because you were talking about with some of the research that they were talking about one dose. I guess let's actually start there. So the one dose in the research, how high were those doses?
They varied,
Okay.
so, and it depends obviously on what's being worked with in a study. But the idea of a macro dose is, it is a dose that is large enough to instigate this potentially mystical experience. So it puts you out of commission, more or less, right? That's this macrodose experience, what people popularly call tripping, or, going on a journey or something like that. And one reason that that has been the most studied way of engaging with psychedelics to date is because, and I discussed this actually with some researchers, um, is because there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? So, in other words, you can help prepare people beforehand. They come in that day, you do this experience that might last 5 hours, 6 hours, whatever, and then they can stay for the whole day. And then, you have follow-up appointments after they go home. And that works very well for research studies. Microdosing, on the other hand, is taking what we call a subpsychedelic dose. And what that means is it's a small dose, and you might take it over not just, one time, but over months even, and every couple days, let's say. And you can drive, you can work, you can parent your kids, you can do life. You get a lot of the plasticity benefits, and you even can have, you can even have a sense of, like, some people will describe a sense of euphoria. People certainly will experience like lots of synchronicities and sort of notice things differently, but they are not altered in a way that they can't operate in everyday life. That's less studied because, as these researchers were telling me at Johns Hopkins, they can't right now send these out into the world so easily. So they would have to call people in and say, okay, today you're microdosing and sit here in our clinic the whole entire day while we watch you, right?
Hmm.
People are not going to like give up every few days to just sit in a clinic for microdosing. So, but microdosing, we are seeing in early studies and certainly in self-reporting, which are a lot of studies now, where they're actually talking to people who are, you know, being surveyed. People experience better energy, less depression. They actually, and this is interesting, less need for like substances they might rely on, right? Like cannabis or alcohol or things. They're like, yeah, I didn't feel I needed that. They feel more social. They feel also, and this was very interesting too in these studies, more motivated to take good care of their bodies. I thought that was so interesting that this is what these master plants and these studies would kind of, the effect that they would have is like, yeah, I wanted to exercise and I wanted to like sleep, get good sleep, and I wanted to like eat well, like things that, um, kind of recognizing like the sacredness of the body, right? Like,
Hmm.
so microdosing is very profound, and it's being looked at now for everything from chronic pain to chronic fatigue to dementia to Parkinson's to, um, all different kinds of mental health disorders. And I think that is going to end up being probably one of the big ways that people are engaging with psychedelics. And then there's quantum dosing. And quantum dosing is interesting because it's very much part of the indigenous approach. Like for indigenous healers, for example, there are these, so for indigenous people, master plants are beings, they're teachers, and they study with them. And then eventually they don't need to ever ingest them again, because they have the teachings in a sense. And um, they have something like, for example, in ayahuasca, um, ayahuasqueros, they're called, they actually have these melodies that they sing called icaros. And the icaros are considered vibrational transmissions from the ayahuasca vine. So it's considered medicine equal in potency to drinking the actual brew.
Oh.
And anyone who's ever been in an ayahuasca ceremony can attest to the fact that when you hear these icaros, and there are different ones for different points in the ceremony, they can make you feel like crying or like vomiting or like coming back into your body and feeling calm. Like each of them has their medicine in a sense, and the physiologic vibrational impact on the body. So this idea of vibrational or quantum dosing is very standard and accepted in indigenous science. And we can talk about actually how indigenous science is very advanced. We're kind of catching up with it now. Almost 70 to 80% of pharmaceuticals that we use right now in Western medicine were derived from people going to indigenous communities, let's say in South America in the jungle, and actually learning from people there what the plants do. Because imagine there's like 100,000, 200,000 different plants that all look very similar in the jungle. So if they didn't know from the actual indigenous people which plant did what, I mean, they could spend, how long just like trying to figure it out by, trial and error. And that's what we have now. We have synthetic versions of plants and medicines that indigenous people actually shared with us. That's the majority of what we have. But in this case, quantum dosing is actually a vibrational dose of a master plant. So that could be, as I said earlier, right? Could be growing the plant, could be a way that you develop that vibrational kind of experience. It could be listening to Icaros. It could be even ingesting. So, we have these quantum drops where they are what we call ceremony in a bottle, and they're made in a ceremonial way with actually music of the plants, which is a device that measures the frequency and vibration of the plant and translates it into music. And we create these in this ceremonial way, and then make them into drops, essentially into a liquid that people can take in their mouths, but it's legal, it's safe, It's fine for people who are sober or children or pregnant or medically sensitive or people for whom psychedelics would not be a good option, or even for people who want to prepare or consider taking psychedelics or are integrating an experience. So that's another way that people can engage with psychedelics is through quantum dosing, which also, and we could talk about the physiology. There's actually very interesting physiology about something called sensory gating that allows us to become more attuned and sensitive to our environment, or less attuned and sensitive to our environment. And that's part of what quantum dosing helps us to modulate.
Very interesting. So you're referring to the quantum drops that you have created.
Yes.
And so what plants are resonant in here?
So we have 3 right now that are available. One is the grandmother, and grandmother is made from the ayahuasca vine. So I grow a 10-year-old ayahuasca vine, and I don't ingest, as I said, my plants. And so this is made in partnership with with this ayahuasca vine. Then there's the grandfather, and that's made from San Pedro cactus. So with with the San Pedro cactus in partnership, not with any plant matter inside. And then the children are made with the mushrooms, psilocybe mushrooms.
Very cool. And so what can somebody expect to experience when consuming these drops?
So, as with psychedelics and master plants in general, part of the experience is that we don't exactly know, right? Part of the medicine is that we don't exactly know what each person will need and how they will experience it. However, I can say people are not going to trip. They're not going to be out of commission, right? That's number one. Number two is what people have described is, and it depends, each of them has a different kind of experience. And anyone who buys them gets a guide of the different kinds of energies, let's say, or the different kinds of experiences people have. So a mutual friend of ours, I won't say who, had been taking the children, and he was interviewing me for something just like this. And the minute I got on, he said, I want to tell you, I've been dancing every day for the past several weeks. And I said, oh, like, that's nice. He said, no, 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 you don't understand. I had no idea. I would wake up in the morning and I would just start dancing. Like, I'd put on music and I'd start dancing. I didn't have coffee. I didn't shower. I didn't get dressed. He's like, and then I realized I had just started taking the children at the time that began. And I basically felt this, like, he would wake up with this sense of joy, right? So each of them has their own kind of way of engaging with us. So it can be like uplifting, euphoric, inner child work. It's very important, right? There's with the grandmother, there can be a lot about engaging with the mother wound, and finding kind of your own lineage, like going into lineage kind of healing. So that's really big. And I will say also that a lot of practitioners who are using these are finding them, whether they're doctors or therapists, are using them with patients or clients and finding that they're seeing people make really significant leaps in their therapies, whether it be medical or mental health.
Excellent. And so it's the kind of thing that you could take every day, and it wouldn't interrupt or interfere with your work or parenting and some of those things you mentioned.
Yeah, I think what I've heard, right? So we've been getting just hundreds of testimonials now, and people actually feel they parent better because they're in a more grounded and centered place. So yes, absolutely. People don't have to take them daily, but I have found that they are probably the most effective if people are really looking for, like, experiencing kind of the full impact and shift. Taking them daily is a great way to do that. But some people will take them, here and there and experience them that way. And any of those things are, available to us. And Some people take one and just go with that one. Some people will switch it. Some people take three, all three. So, I think it depends on what the person is aiming for, what kind of shifts and what kind of openings.
Gotcha. Okay. And so there's information on your website to determine, to help people determine which one might be a good fit for them.
Well, so usually people will get a set of three and work with
Mhm.
them that way. And they get, at the same time that they're purchasing, they get a guide. So they know how to engage with each of them and which they might want to start with, and how I give them a lot of sample regimens that they can work with.
Excellent. And for people who are more sensitive, like MCAS, mast cell activation, or something like that, where they react to foods and sometimes to other plants, do you find that they need to start with drops instead of going to a full dropper full initially, or what's been your experience?
So I think actually that quantum dosing is the perfect way for people who have those kinds of conditions that, like, highly sensitive people uh, do the best with quantum dosing. Even though it's potent, it's very, very gentle because it's made of vibration, right? Rather than having lots of different compounds within it. But I always recommend for someone who's very sensitive to try one drop, you know, and you can even, and this is something like I learned from homeopaths, decades ago, is, you know, sleep with it next to your bed. Put it in a beautiful place, I always say, because something that's vibrational, you want to like always support that by, putting it next to plants or, in a beautiful spot, or if people keep an altar or anything like that, like have your quantum drops in a place like that. And then, be with it a little bit, right? And that, I think, for people with MCAS and similar conditions, what I've seen over the years is that they need to bring things very gently into their field, if that makes sense. Um, and so starting with a drop, or even starting just by wearing it in their pocket for the day and then working their way up is perfectly fine. But we have not seen people be sensitive to these in terms of having reactions to the contents.
Excellent. And so, if you were to rub a crystal ball and say what's going to happen here in the near future, do you think that psychedelics are going to become part of mainstream medicine?
I think that I do think that psychedelics are, um, we can't ignore what they have to offer. And it's just so different than anything we have available to help people right now. So I do think that they are very much going to become part of mainstream medicine. And that's actually why we're doing a training for psychedelic informed practitioners, is because that's actually one of the hurdles, is having people who are educated and can really offer these in an informed way to their patients and clients. That's considered actually nationally one of like our biggest issues in terms of making this available. But I do think that they'll be available. I think, as with everything in mainstream medicine, there are going to be hiccups. So that's part of why I wrote my book, was so that people can be educated and know how to think about these, know what they can expect, what they can't expect. I always say, like, psychedelics are not a magic pill. They are a window or a door, right? They're like a portal, and they open certain possibilities to us, and then we have to walk through that door ultimately. So I want people to be very well informed, and it's a book for anybody. I mean, I think it's great for practitioners, but it's also, I'm told, very readable for anybody who even doesn't have a science background at all, and sort of goes through things from a medical scientific standpoint. And actually, I talk about things like plant consciousness and things like that, and then it takes us through kind of the spiritual and ceremonial part and what that can offer as well.
Excellent. And I think you have a link to a free gift for our audience, which is the first 3 chapters. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. And we'll drop that below. Thank you so much for that. And then we'll also drop links below for where to find Dr. Maya as well as the quantum drops. Is there anything else you want to say about that or tell us where people can find you? But we'll drop in some specific links also.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people can always find me just at drmaya.com, and I'm on Instagram as well. But I just, we have tons of free resources on my website, and I'm always really happy to answer any questions. I welcome that. So please, feel free to reach out.
Brilliant. Well, I so appreciate the work that you're doing in the world, Maya. When we met well, it's not 10 years ago. When we met, I don't know, 7 years ago, who knew that you were going to be moving in this direction, right? So it's super interesting. And the training of practitioners, I think, is incredibly important. You might see me sign up for one of those. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. This was really always a pleasure to be able to spend time with you and to do this.
Yeah. I'll see you soon. I hope you learned something on today's podcast. If you did, please share it with your friends and family and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It's really helpful for getting this information out to more people who desperately need it. Sharing all the experts I know and love and the powerful tips I have is one of my absolute favorite things to do. Thanks for being part of my community. Just a reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. It is provided with the understanding that it does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Thanks for listening and have an amazing day.